Talk Radio.
Hello, good evening. 23 minutes past 10, it's Friday on Talk Radio. Thank you for your company this evening. Let's get into the Friday panel then, shall we? And whip through some of the big stories of the week. Matteo Bergamini is a journalist and broadcaster, as is Noah Khogali as well. And both of them join you now. Noah, Matteo, hello, good evening, boys.
Hello, evening.
Thanks for being with us. Looking forward to this one. Listen, I really want to start with this question that I think will be at the centre of the thinking in number 10 this weekend, or Chequers, wherever Boris Johnson and his team is the one who is Lord is left of his team are spending their weekend. Would you work for Boris Johnson? If reports are to be believed, he's struggling to build a team. He's struggling to bring people in to fill some of the gaps that he's lost. Noah?
Well, I mean, if you like a drink at work, if you like a party, and if you like a job that when you leave you can walk right into another one in Whitehall, I mean, it sounds like a perfect job. But if you're a talented civil servant looking for, a long and illustrious career, it's not exactly something I would recommend going to at the moment. It's a bit high risk, I think.
Matteo?
I think asking that question is like asking, knowing what we know of the Titanic, would you take a trip? It would be a hell of a ride, but ultimately end in tragedy. No, I wouldn't. I mean, it's the level of scandals and just the way all the stories that we've heard, it's just not something that I think anyone with any sense of moral compass would ever tie themselves to.
I always remember watching The West Wing, right? And there was a brilliant storyline of The West Wing where a Republican, activist or whatever advisor was employed by what was a Democratic White House, right? And there was this sort of central theme in the program that in this storyline that when the president calls, regardless of their colour, as in political colour, you serve, right? You serve. And if Boris Johnson picked the phone up and he said, Noah, I want you in my team, I want you to come here, not serve me, but serve the country in Downing Street, is there not a bit of you that would feel the obligation, the public service tug?
Yeah, I mean, it would be very tempting, and that's a massive thing to say no to, whether at the beginning of a career or the end of it. But ultimately, not that I would, but I'm 21, and if I got that call, I'd like my career to, number one, not start off with, something that's really probably going to tarnish it in the long run, or just end up as a flash in the pan, somebody who's in Downing Street ultimately for, maybe as little as 10 days, and then immediately cast out again. Because realistically, whoever comes in next, whether that's next week, or whether that's after May, or whether that's in 3 years' time, they're going to have to do a complete clear out of everybody that's in there, even purely to maintain public image. So although it'd be really, really tempting, and like many civil servants would, you'd have a desire to serve your country, because that's ultimately why you would go into that, I would hope. It's maybe not the best thing for your career, and that does influence these people. They're not robots as much as they may seem to be at times.
And Matteo, is there any part of you that thinks, actually, this is a really fascinating challenge? Can this be saved? Could you get in there and turn this ship around? I mean, perhaps not you, Matteo, because I know you're not sort of. It's not your politics. Not that you'd want to turn the ship around. It's not your politics. But ultimately, for one of those people who perhaps do, who is a conservative, who does sort of rather like Boris Johnson's idea of Britain. The chance to get in there and to be part of turning the ship around, do you think that there is anybody out there who thinks that's possible?
I'm sure there is. I'm sure there will be people that will think it is possible. But like I said, at a certain point, you've got to think, well, whoever the next person is going to be is going to have to do a clear out, because the level of tarnishing that Boris Johnson's name has done to the position, to the government, has been so great that there is going to have to be a clear out. So whatever, I mean, you can try, but at a certain point, not to beat the Titanic analogy too much, but at a certain point, you've got to realize when you're a little bit too close to the iceberg, and you do have to kind of jump ship.
Yeah. It's still working for you, that analogy, Matteo. Run with it, my friend.
A little bit, right?
Noah, you're perhaps more of Boris Johnson's thinking, right? You're somebody who would, if things were going well, would probably take that call to go and work in a Conservative government's central office in Downing Street. Is there not a part of you that thinks, if the call came, I could turn this around?
I mean, there would be a very small part of it. And at the end of the day, I do think there's a factor here for a lot of Conservatives, and this has been in the general fallout as well, that Boris Johnson does occasionally, at least, the policymaking coming out of Number 10 seems to be conservative in name only. And that's been a frustration, I think, for lots of the party base and huge swathes of the public. So it would affect, I think, a lot of people going for that role, whether they thought they were actually going to work for a conservative government with a conservative ideology, in the vein of something that's going to have an ism put at the end of it in history. Johnsonism is not going to be something remembered, kindly for the overhaul of the political system in a positive manner. And you'd want to be part of something like that. And I think that would be the main sticking point for me looking at this government now, is that it's not that.
But don't you also get the sense, Noah, and I certainly do, that Boris Johnson actually is sort of persuadable, right? That if you were to get in there, and it's not my politics, it's not Mateo's, but if you were to go in there and were to suggest a tweak to what Johnsonism is, that he could probably go for it if he felt it was the way that the wind was blowing, right? Because I don't know if Boris Johnson actually does honestly believe in anything other than Boris Johnson.
Well, I mean, the EU referendum showed that, pretty clearly, in that Boris can flip very quickly. But I think lots of what has come out of this iteration of Number 10 has suggested that there is, somebody rather major in Downing Street, especially after the departure of Dominic Cummings, that is making a lot, or, formulating a lot of the direction this government's going in. And that person is immeasurably closer to Boris Johnson than I ever could be. And there's been lots of questions raised across the political spectrum about the influence of Carrie on this government. And I'm not saying she's responsible for everything, but I don't think if I wanted to influence Boris Johnson's policy, that I'm going to have a greater impact, than somebody that lives in the flat with him the whole time.
Is it? I mean, Matteo, you're nodding. I mean, is it fair, or is it? Because I must admit, the more that I see, and I'm not here to hold a candle for her by any stretch of the imagination, or them as a couple, but the more that I see about this sort of Carrie idea, this sort of narrative that Carrie is really the one that's pulling the strings here, and that she's the one that's persuading him. And maybe that's true. I mean, don't we all, go home to our partners and discuss over dinner what's going on, and you might sort of change your mind. That's perfectly natural and perfectly normal, isn't it? But is she carrying the can a bit here for his failures?
I would say that. I mean, yeah, like you say, we all do it. I mean, I know. I sometimes go home and I'll speak to my partner about my work, and she may say that's a terrible idea, do something else. Yeah. And sometimes that won't very much happen.
Yeah, I hear that a lot as well.
9 out of 10, right?
That's strange, isn't it?
Right. But at the end of the day, he's the one in the seat, and I don't think we should be pushing the blame onto her. I don't think that. At the end of the day, it's his choice. He's the one in the position of power. He's the one running the country. And whether we believe that he's influenced by her, to be honest, in my opinion, is completely irrelevant. At the end of the day, he's the one that is in the hot seat.
Okay, chap, stick about. I want to talk about his neighbour. The Chancellor has got a heck of a job on his hands. In amongst all of this political uproar and upheaval, genuine problems, real problems that people are going to face in the next couple of weeks, months, I mean days even. I think people are starting to feel the pinch of the cost of living crisis now. Question I want to ask you guys next, which I genuinely at this point don't really know the answer to. Can a Chancellor who is from a billionaire family, somebody who will never, ever in his lifetime, never has and never will, feel the pinch of a cost of living crisis, really be the person to shepherd the country through it? We'll ask that next on Talk Radio. Think about Troll. We'll ask our Friday panel that shortly. Matteo Bergamini joins us, and Noah Khogali as well. Chaps, firstly, I want to come to this issue of the Chancellor. I think this is a really interesting question, and as I said, I'm not really 100% sure how I feel or what the answer is. But the cost of living crisis is biting, no doubt about that. That's absolutely happening and will continue to happen in the next couple of months and over the course of the next year. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the person whose job it is to try to guide us alongside the Prime Minister, I suppose, through that, is himself a multimillionaire. He's from the family of a billionaire. His wife's father is a billionaire. He will never know what it's like to feel the cost of living crisis. He will be able to heat his home and eat, and that is a choice that some people have to make. Noah, can you, as the Chancellor, who will never feel the cost of living crisis, really be a person to guide the country through it?
I really don't think it makes a huge amount of difference. Obviously, that understanding of what families and individuals are going through is important. That's very different from being able to feel those emotions yourself. But I don't think in the long term that good policy making is only reliant on being able to personally relate to, the issue that you're trying to fix. Frankly, I think it's overall it would be rather unrealistic to expect that everybody in government could feel and understand every single issue in society personally, because to be honest, we've got a lot of them, and that would require a far more bloated governmental structure than we've got now, essentially involving hundreds of thousands of people that understand every tiny issue, and that's not realistic. And we shouldn't be making excuses for bad policy making just because one hasn't experienced something themselves.
Okay, Matteo?
I would actually tend to agree with that. I think it's like saying, an expert in, I don't know, say climate change, or just because you don't live in a country that's massively affected by climate change, for example, you can't talk about it or do research on it. Your background, yes, I mean, he won't be necessarily emotionally linked to it, as Noah mentioned, but at the end of the day, I think what's more important is looking at his track record of what he's done in the past. I mean, if you look at the beginning of the pandemic, when a load of the kind of helping small businesses schemes came out, like the bounce back loan, for example. And these were genuinely, I mean, in my view, genuinely good policies. I know a lot of organizations that were saved by those policies. So one could argue also, oh, you're part of a billionaire family, so therefore you won't have a clue how to save small businesses. But in reality, in retrospect, those were pretty decent policies at the time. So I don't think someone, what background they're born in necessarily has a massive impact on whether they can legislate on an issue. And also, we've got to forget that these people are not individuals making up policy on their own. They've got a team of people around them, some of whom will come from those backgrounds, some of whom won't. But it's not, Rishi Sunak is not the chancellor on his own. The chancellor is like him and the entire team. So I'd say that, the background, I mean, yeah, makes great headlines, but in terms of actual policy making, I don't know if it has that much of an impact.
Yeah, it's a fair point, isn't it? And no, I wonder if this, look, this is the story of our country, isn't it? The history of Great Britain is us being ruled by people who don't really know what it's like to live in the country, right? There are certain sections of society who have long been and actually remain unrepresented at the top of British politics. There are a sprinkling now of working class people in politics. There's a lot more of them, absolutely, and a lot more diversity of experience and diversity of thought. But ultimately, Noah, a crisis like this, when you are skint, when you are really skint, and the decision that you have to make is between eating and being warm, that's a physiological response, isn't it? That's an emotional and physical decision that you have to make. And I wonder if there's something about not having been there that means that he won't understand the urgency and be compelled every day as he wakes up to make the right decision. I mean, we're still seeing. I mean, there is no. I mean, there could be a windfall tax on companies tomorrow. He could do that if he wanted to, but he is ideologically against doing it. He's going ahead with a national insurance rise that is deeply unpopular in his party and would absolutely increase the cost of living for people who are the lowest earners. It does seem from the policy that he actually doesn't get it.
I think it gets really complicated the more you think about it, as everything in politics does. And I do think there's an element here, and I'm not saying it exists in this specific scenario, but in this scenario that we see across every country, across every political spectrum, across the entirety of history, where you end up having some people rise to the top and they're not necessarily entirely representative of everybody in society, is that there may be some benefit to not being in a precarious position yourself. So if you go to somebody now who is, and terribly so, dealing with really, really hard times and go, what do you need right now to fix this? Lots of them will be like, well, I need financial support right now. A grant would be great. And that's fantastic. That would help them in the short term. But if you're doing that for what could be 50% of the country, you're going to have massive economic ramifications elsewhere.
So you're saying that an element of detachment and also almost a sort of cold, hard fiscal calculation rather than being wrapped up in the emotion of the situation could be helpful. Matteo, is that right?
I wouldn't say that's necessarily true at all. I think having an emotional, obviously, I mean, a person that comes from, say, a low socioeconomic background that is in that position now won't necessarily be still in that position. But having an understanding of having been in that position, it would of course be helpful because you've been there, so you understand what it actually means to heat your home or feed your children. You can understand that. But then again, as I say, it's down to, for me, more important to know what their track record is. Because someone that comes from a wealthy background may have a good track record in terms of policy making, and someone that doesn't necessarily come from a wealthy background may still not know what to do. Because it's one thing understanding that individual environment; it's a completely different thing to then know how to solve it. Just because you're in that environment doesn't mean you know how to solve it.
Yeah.
We're all living through climate change, for example, doesn't mean we all know how to solve this issue.
And the proof of the pudding is in the eating, isn't it? Always. And actually, what you do perhaps is more important than where you came from. Matteo, Noah, stick about. We'll talk about.
Failed to start.
Talk Radio. There's still a good argument for listening.
Hello there, good evening, 11:15 on Talk Radio. Matteo Bergamini joins us with Noah Khogali as well. Both of them journalists, both of them on our Friday panel. Chaps, the Winter Olympics has begun in China. Big questions, of course, about China's human rights record, and actually a huge amount of questions, really, about China and their role in the global community. There is a diplomatic boycott. You won't see any British diplomats there or dignitaries, same with the US as well, but our athletes have gone and they will compete. Noah, what's our role in that? Do we watch? Do we not watch?
It's hard, and I'd like to preface this answer by actually saying I lived in China for a long part of my childhood.
Right.
So seeing that country develop into what it is today is something that I saw firsthand, and it really does worry me to my core. And as a result, even though I don't think, telling everybody on the street to boycott the Winter Olympics, because I don't think that's fair on the athletes who have worked immensely hard to get there and to perfect their craft, I don't think we should be telling everyone just don't watch. It's something I can't really get on board with, just because turning it onto the TV would just remind me of the country that it's in and the terrible atrocities that they're committing, and that the world community seem to be taking a very, very soft-handed view of.
So you won't be watching, not necessarily to sort of just put pressure on China or for them to receive poor viewing figures, which would make a difference, wouldn't it? I mean, for sure, that would. You don't think so? You think
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I think when you're dealing with China, you're dealing with a country that is so focused on inside of its own borders that the external doesn't matter. Nobody in the world could be watching it, and the Chinese government would still tell its people that it was number one in every single country, and they would believe them.
Right, okay.
It doesn't really matter. The Chinese government says what's the truth.
But what you're saying, Noah, is that you wouldn't watch it personally because it would be personally too difficult for you.
Yeah, it would put an unsettling feeling in my stomach, I think. Just, you remember what was happening to the Uyghurs, what was probably happening to a number of different ethnicities, and the atrocities that they, committed on the people that they would also proclaim to be their own. That's something really, really hard to stomach.
Matteo?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a difficult one, and I would, to some extent, I'd agree. I mean, the level of human rights abuse. I mean, the country's government is really abhorrent. The issue is, of course, as Noah said, that countries like China, it's not about what external people think. They know and often don't care what individuals in Western countries think of the government. It's not about that. It's, they will portray whatever they want to portray, and it's an amazing propaganda tool for their government to then push on their people. The one thing I would say, though, that we can do by not watching, and yes, it is unfair to the athletes, but one thing we can do with not watching is send the message to the Olympic Committee that gave them the bid, to say actually people are just not going to partake by watching this sport anymore if you're going to keep giving it to countries that are abhorrent in their abuses of human beings. And I think that is a message worth sending.
That's a really good point, isn't it, Noah? Actually, if China aren't going to hear it, the Olympic Committee might.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it would start getting into the measure of people in the UK not watching it versus whatever amount of money China is put behind it. And I think you saw that with Qatar and with all of the FIFA corruption, is that money going into individual people's pockets can potentially have a huge impact on where these large tournaments goes. And in the long term, there's hopefully going to be more eyes on that, because I would hope that China and Qatar just kind of draw a line in the sand where we go, we probably shouldn't be doing this anymore. It's really not particularly moral really questionable in terms of the international relations aspect as well, and that we shouldn't do that anymore. But I hoped that wouldn't be the case when Qatar was awarded the World Cup, and yet here we are.
Yeah, right. And that's going to happen. We're going to go. I mean, it's on. I think it will happen later on this year, and that is slightly different to China, isn't it, Noah? That element that you talk about. It is a much more open country, and the people of Qatar will probably hear how things are going, beyond their borders, in the way that China don't necessarily. What do we do about Qatar then? I mean, do we go? Do we boycott? Do we do what we're doing with China? What do we do?
Yeah, you're right. It is slightly different, and I think there will be a large number of people that don't go. Partially, maybe because they don't feel safe, even though that's not as much of an issue as it may be in China or maybe in other countries. Some people will just feel uncomfortable going somewhere like Qatar when it's been very public what has gone on to make that World Cup possible. And I would imagine you will probably see reduced numbers of people going, but there is a limited capacity. So those spots might be taken by other people. Ultimately, the pressure needs to be applied before these countries receive these tournaments, and that needs to be possibly applied by governments who go, you know what, we're probably not going to take part in this tournament, and that's the line.
Yeah, and
this line we're taking now, where a halfway house is, a bit wet.
Yeah, and that very nearly happened with Russia. I mean, the poisonings happened, didn't they? Not long before, I think, if my timeline is right, the World Cup in 2018 in Russia. And I must say, Matteo, I was sort of, in the run up to that World Cup, I was thinking, I'm not going to watch this. I'm not going to do it. I was utterly determined to do it. And then England started playing, and they started playing quite well. And I did watch. I'm slightly ashamed to say I did. I watched it, and I sort of parked my reservations, my deep concerns, my genuine.
Everyone's got their price.
Yeah, right. Well, the semi-final, it turns out, is my price. What do we do with Qatar then, Matteo? Is it realistic for us to say if it goes ahead, we're not going to watch it?
I mean, if we are going to take a stand, if people are generally going to take a stand with China, then you kind of got to take a stand with everybody that's doing mad levels of human rights abuse, and Qatar is no different. There is huge amounts of human rights abuse. We've heard tons of stories of workers, suffering immense conditions. So, if you're going to do it with China, you kind of have to do it with every country that has these human rights abuses, which, that long list starts to become very thin after a while. But, if you want the Olympic Committee...
But that's not a problem, is it? I mean, is that... I mean, if
No, not at all. If you're so inclined, not at all. And if you want the organisers of the Olympics to start to take note, boycotting just China is not going to cut it in any way, shape or form, because anyway, like Noah said, money often speaks, and the only way money will stop being funneled into these events is if people stop watching them until the organisers of the Olympics start to change their tune.
Noah?
So you kind of have to do it with everybody.
Yeah. Noah, can we do that? Is that doable?
I don't know. It's really hard as well, because boycotting these kind of events, even at home, has a massive impact beyond just, hurting the Olympic Committee or hurting the sports involved or hurting the countries involved. That has an impact on the bars, the pubs, all of the supply chains, the drinks manufacturers. All of those people are affected up and down the country. Even somebody that just, works in the pub on a Saturday night might not be asked to come in for their shift if there's no appetite. So there is a really delicate balance here between, doing the quote-unquote righteous thing and not harming people in our own country because of...
And there is also this argument, isn't there, Noah? And just perhaps to defend the Olympic Committee just for a moment, and certainly FIFA, who would probably make this argument, that giving these countries these kind of tournaments, it does put pressure on them. It opens them up to the world. It means that they do have to be more liberal. They have to liberalise, and they have to, it does put pressure on them to be better. Does actually freezing them out, countries like Qatar and perhaps China, slightly different. Matteo, you're shaking your head. I'll come to you in a minute. Does freezing them out, though, not perpetuate the problem, and actually having big sporting events in these countries force them to act?
Well, I mean, we had the Olympics in China in 2008, and it is far less liberal now than it was then. I also can't see a world where we hold the Olympics in North Korea. I don't think, as much as that might work in theory, there is a human issue here, and you also have to convince people to go to these countries. and also dealing with countries that don't necessarily act in our understanding of a rational manner makes it all far more complicated than I think.
It has started to work a little bit, though, in Saudi Arabia, though, hasn't it? Saudi Arabia have, for all of the awful atrocities that Saudi Arabia continue to put their name to and to commit, there has been, I think you probably could very easily describe it as being tokenistic, but there have been moments of liberalisation in those countries since they started taking on more sporting events that put the spotlight on them.
You have to decide, I think, where you can personally draw the line at that point. I mean, you end up almost slipping into an appeasement scenario where you go, well, we'll give you a World Cup if you stop throwing gay people off of buildings. And that's a weird tit for tat that we probably shouldn't be doing and sits very, very uncomfortably with me.
You should just do that. You should just not throw gay people off buildings because it's
and we should just kind of respect the countries in the 21st century don't.
Yeah, exactly. Matteo, go on, you were shaking your head.
No, I was just going to say that I think that's, I mean, of course they would say that, but it's just fundamentally untrue. These sporting events, if anything, embolden these regimes because it gives them, again, a propaganda tool to flaunt to their people of how the international community sees them. It allows them to potentially tweak the games to show how successful they are. Like Noah said, China will do well regardless, and the people will be told what the government needs them to be told. I mean, for example, the 1936 Summer Olympics were given to Germany at the time during when they were controlled by the Nazis. So things didn't really improve after that. So it's just fundamentally untrue.
But I wonder if there's a version of history there where you could say actually, that did, for Europe that shined a real spotlight on that country and the Allied resistance to Nazi Germany started to grow from that point. And I suppose there is an argument about. There are several stories of athletes who would have been persecuted by Nazi Germany, but went and competed and were brilliant, in the face of Adolf Hitler whilst he stood in the thing. And that was actually, that was a really big, bold, symbolic political moment, maybe. We've not quite got time to go down that rabbit hole, unfortunately. But it's an interesting point. Just very briefly, while we're on the subject of banning things, very, very briefly, chaps, because we're tight on time. Noah, British Bulldogs, Norway are going to ban them. Because of they are very clearly prone to severe health problems and facial defects, and they've concluded it's no longer humane to breed British Bulldogs. Should we follow suit?
Well, this feels like the kind of story that will be on the third page of the Daily Mail and get lots of people really angry because it feels like an attack on Britishness.
Yes, exactly.
But to be honest, I don't think that it should be that dramatic that we ask dog breeders to not breed dogs that are unhealthy and in pain. I don't feel like that should be really a debate. And I think if you frame it like that, a lot of people will go, yeah, that's fine. But if you go, no, we're going to ban British Bulldogs, it will get a lot of people very red-faced and kind of, frothing in their warm beer, I think.
Yeah. Matteo?
I couldn't agree more. I actually, when I saw this story, I thought of the story had to have a British flag in the background, the bulldog wearing a hat, and, the kind of standard typical headline. Yeah, no, I mean, if the dogs are in severe health conditions, you're breeding an animal, and it's going to suffer for the rest of its life. Why on earth would you carry on doing that in any logical way?
It's a very interesting test of how far blind nationalism will go, though, isn't it? Really, you think when you attach the word
Pretty
British
much
to it, and a British bulldog being a symbol of national pride, a horrific thing to put a poor animal through, and yet something that we are willing to do in the interest of that blind nationalism for some in some quarters. I don't know, really. Maybe that's not actually true. Matteo, nice to talk to you. Noah, thank you so much for your time this evening, boys. Really good to chat to you on the Friday panel this evening. Matteo Bergamini, Noah Khogali as well with you on Talk Radio. Okay.